Welcome to the Joe Schmo Show. I'm your host, Joe Pucci. And quick programming note, what I intend on doing going forward is the same pattern as these podcasts have gone this week. So I'll be posting Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday at some point during the evening, Eastern Standard Time, uh, just so you're aware and hopefully can look out for them in the future. I'll give updates if this changes at some point, and of course, they'll probably be mostly around 25 to 35 minutes each. So, first, I want to update on some of the things that have been going on that I've covered in my previous podcasts. First, the update on Iran. Over the last 48 hours or so, the Iranian regime has completely cut off the internet. Some reports that phone lines have been cut, GPS signal and satellite signal being jammed. So that means Starlink can't really get a good connection, and this seems to be across the entire country. When I initially heard of this about 48 hours ago, my initial expectation was this was an attempt to prevent people from coordinating for protests and demonstrations, and that is true. Another thing I was concerned about, but hopeful it wasn't the case, turns out it is, was that the regime is using this to cover up mass casualty repression. In the wake of yesterday's massive protests, and they were massive, it is reported that at least 50 people were killed in violence by the regime. Those reports are likely well below what the actual number, what the actual figure of killed alone is. I've also heard reports of 250 to 200. Again, this is likely very low compared to the actual figure. It's a very sad situation that people are dying, but they're still out there protesting. They're still out there demonstrating. They clearly are motivated to change the regime, to change their country, and get it on track to being a democracy and building it back to the greatness it once had. Now, another factor is that the intelligence assessments, the U.S. intelligence assessments, has been reported, are starting to consider these protests to be a genuine threat to the regime. Whereas prior to events of last night, it seems like the intelligence assessment was that these protests were not significant enough to pose a genuine threat to the Iranian regime. As a result, the more these intelligence assessments align with a possibility of regime overthrow and either the exiled Prince Reza Pahlavi coming back and leading a transitionary period for that will end with an Iranian secular democracy, or some other transition that, and with the end result being the same. Uh, uh, the more these intelligence assessments suggest that the Iranian regime is very vulnerable, the more likely there is to be some United States action against the Iranian regime. So, my question is, what does that actually look like? So, we have an example of some action the United States under Trump took against a foreign power, referring to the Nicolas Maduro arrest at the hands of the United States military, Delta Force. The There are key differences between Venezuela and Iran, though. Uh, Part of the problem with Iran is it's not just the Ayatollah, and it's not like the United States can exert as much pressure on Iran as we have on Venezuela to capitulate to our demands. I definitely do not project or believe that there will be boots on the ground, so to speak, except for perhaps special ops missions that are in and out, boots on the ground for a couple of hours, if not less than that, and out. Okay. Um, Obviously, Trump has a deep aversion to large scale conflicts. Putting boots on the ground for any longer than is necessary to complete a single mission. He's shown this time and time again, whether it was flying B-2s over Iran in, was it the June or July? I don't remember. The 12-day war. Um, Flew B-2s over, knocked out their nuclear infrastructure, got out, no boots on the ground, a single mission, and that was the end of it. So as a result, whatever action is taken, I strongly doubt it's going to lead to a costly U.S. involvement on the ground, at least. Um, Generally, it seems like my assessment would be that there is a strong possibility that if certain elements of the regime are eliminated, the Iranian people, along with a potential return of this exiled prince, Reza Pahlavi, to lead an interim period, would be a sufficient situation, a sufficient paradigm to meet the demands of that would be required in order for the United States to take any action. Obviously, Trump has already said that Iran has said to Iran not to kill its own civilians, its own people. As we have seen in the past, Trump follows his word. I don't think these are empty threats. You want to talk about empty threats or empty words? Look at the rest of the world. Look at Europe. They say things and don't act on them. I'll come back to that, but very frustrating to listen to some people in Europe say one thing and do absolutely nothing about it. Over the next 48 hours or so, I expect these protests to continue. Uh, it is at the moment the middle of the night in Iran, about 3:30 in the morning. They're 7.5 hours ahead of us in Eastern time. Excuse me, sorry about that. So as of right now, I don't know if there's any protests going on into the night. I wouldn't be surprised. And then going into the weekend, I expect to see more large-scale protests. And of course, unfortunately, with the internet being blacked out, we're not going to get a great deal of information about what's going on. Very, small snippets of what's actually going on have actually gotten out to um, open source intelligence reporters, and those accordingly have gotten to the media, and that's what you're seeing. If you watch the news, any news, I'm not sure if CNN or MSNBC or MSN Now is covering any of this, but others are. Um, so I'm not saying the regime is going to fall within the next 48 hours. It is possible, but it probably is going to take longer than that. The motivation is there. On a more philosophical note, I know a lot of people on the right tend to want to avoid uh, getting involved in other countries, try and be more insulated, more insular, whether that's in relation to, say, action against Iran or even Venezuela or other places, or maybe even, decreasing our involvement in Europe. So philosophically, this is honestly one of the dumbest things that could be done. And here's why. I don't mean to call anyone stupid, but if you think about it, in becoming more insular, isolated within our own country is not the answer to any geopolitical threat, and it will only allow those geopolitical threats to expand. Okay, and China, Russia, Iran, as it is now, North Korea, they won't stop hating us just because we isolate ourselves. They'll take advantage of that. Okay, they'll take advantage. Now, one of the reasons why we have a global footprint is because our economy is global, and we need to have a global footprint to promote those economic interests abroad. And by the way, this is not nefarious. This is peaceful economic development, economic engagement with the rest of the world. We do a lot of business with Europe. We're not really taking advantage of Europe. If anything, they're taking advantage of us, or at least they were prior to the Trump tariffs. I mean, think about Europe doesn't get any of our cars, but we get a lot of European cars. Anyway, point is there's a lot of economic engagement around the world, and in order for that to continue, and that aids the United States at home, that aids employment, that aids your paychecks, that aids prices of commodities of goods that you buy, whether it's at the grocery store or cars or anything, right? Yes, I would like to see more things built in the United States, but we're still a global economy. We're still interconnected globally. And that is more for the better than it is for the worse. There are things that can change uh, to promote fairness, especially to the American worker, especially when you consider that Chinese goods are cheap because they use basically slave labor, and businesses take advantage of that fact and give you cheap goods as a result. That's not good. But then we enrich China that way. So obviously there are things that can change. I'm not saying there shouldn't be change on the economic side of things when it comes to the global interconnectedness. But by and large, it vastly helps the United States to be economically engaged with the world. As a result, I mean, part of that is promoting our national interest. You can do that in a number of ways. Trump really approaches it through an economic standpoint, through the tariffs, projecting power that way, projecting power diplomatically, and obviously sometimes not just for economic reasons, but for more severe reasons, you go to war. And in between that diplomatic approach and that full out war approach is these actions that can be taken, smaller actions like taking out Maduro, or potentially like taking out uh, Khamenei, or the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Uh, this is a reasonable approach, and we can debate how far should we go in getting involved in geopolitical affairs. How what hill should we die on? Um, what stand should we take? Okay, but when we do take a stand, we need to stick to it, unless there's a damn good reason not to, right? For example, when the Syrian civil war began, I forget the year, but Obama gave Syria a red line and said, "We're going to act if you use chemical weapons." Okay, Syria used chemical weapons. What did Obama do? Absolutely nothing. And what happened as a result was he abdicated the responsibility he incurred on himself to act and gave that responsibility to Russia, which said, "Oh, we'll come in and make sure there's no chemical weapons use," which gave them an opportunity to come into Syria, broadening their sphere of influence in the world, which, as we can tell, is not a good thing when you give Russia more influence over other areas of the world. So as a result, he said something, whether he should have said it or not, debatable, sure. But that fact that he didn't stick to it is bad in that instant, and also bad beyond that, because our adversaries know, at least in the Obama years, that he's not, you can't take him at his word, right? You can't, he says something, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to act. So for any politician, for any president, it really is important to stick to what you say. Otherwise, that's going to have ramifications going forward. And I do believe that Trump is really good about sticking to what he says he's going to do, and trying to get those things done. So in this particular instance with Iran, when he says the United States is going to act if Iran starts or continues to kill its own citizens, I do believe that some sort of U.S. action will occur in the relatively near future as these protests continue to expand and as the regime continues its massive crackdown on its citizens. I don't know when. I'm not going to project when. That's all I can say about that. And for those on the TDS, Trump derangement syndrome left, that use the phrase taco, Trump always chickens out, give me a break. Give me a break. What's funny is people that say Trump always chickens out using that phrase, and then they turn around and complain when he actually does something, right? So, hypocrisy. Just damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? That's how they act towards Trump. Now, On the domestic front, a little update on the Minneapolis situation with ICE. So I wrote an article that I'll link to, where I laid out some of the statutory um, legitimation legitimacy for ICE operations, for some of the counterpoints to some of the things you hear on the left. One of these is that ICE isn't actually law enforcement, and you have no reason to obey their orders. They can't give you orders like a police officer or FBI agent might be able to, and that's patently false. 8 USC section 1357 subsection A, subsection 5 authorizes, quote, any officer or employee of the service authorized under regulations prescribed by the Attorney General, which is to describe ICE, shall have power without warrant, subsection 5, to make arrests, subsection A, for any offense against the United States if the offense is committed in the officer's or employee's presence, subsection B, for any felony cognizable under the laws of the United States if the officer or employee has reasonable grounds to believe that a person to be arrested has committed or is committing such a felony. Right there, it is very clear that along with doing their duties as immigration officers, if a case presents itself where someone is committing, regardless of whether they're an American citizen or not, uh, a, a criminal act, they have the authority to arrest that person. So that blows one of these narratives about ICE not having the authority to arrest American citizens completely out of the water. Now, what they do in terms of detention, whether they hand over this person to local law enforcement or whatever the case might be, that comes under regulations within ICE. I'm not familiar with any of that particularly, but the authority to arrest exists. And if you're complaining about ICE arresting American citizens and not having authority, you're completely wrong. Another trope that I have heard is that um, crossing the border illegally is only a civil offense. Well, and I actually questioned this myself until I looked up the actual law, which is actually something you really should do and is far easier nowadays with search engines and to some degree AI. AI is a great tool to search for sources, at least, not just information, but sources for information on matters such as this. I would also suggest just looking up the U.S. Code. Um, 8 USC 1325 provides for both criminal and civil penalties. And it states in the law that uh, one is not in lieu of the other. So an illegal immigrant someone who crosses the border illegally, thus making them an illegal immigrant, commits a crime that is punishable up to 3 times. One criminal, okay, and the differentiation is if it's the first time you're crossing the border illegally, it's a misdemeanor. You can serve up to 6 months in jail. If you cross the border more than once illegally, you're subject to a felony. You're punishable by up to 2 years in prison. Now, more often than not, a lot of these people are just removed from the United States. They're not hold up in an American jail, nor really should they be, because that just incurs greater expense on the U.S. taxpayers instead of just sending them back, especially if they don't have any criminal record beforehand in their home country or in the United States. Just send them back. Now, in addition to that, they're liable for civil penalties for crossing the border. This is separate to and in addition to the criminal penalties. The third penalty, which is what people probably cite wrongfully when they're referring to illegal immigrants crossing the border, is that if you fail to obey an order for removal, which you go through the immigration court process and then you get an order for final removal. If you fail to obey that, that is a civil penalty. Again, these are arguments that the left tends to use to one degree or another, I actually think that one of our Congress people actually said that's not a criminal offense to cross the border illegally, and I don't remember who it is. I think it was one of the squad members, but I don't remember who it is, and I'm not going to mischaracterize a specific person's statements and get it wrong. But one of them did do this, say this. She got it wrong. I know it was a she, by the way. Um, so she got it wrong, and whether she knows she's wrong or is just ignorant of the fact, I mean, honestly, you should know, especially as an elected person, you should know your facts before you say shit because you're just going to be called out on it. Like I'm calling you out now, even though obviously I don't have the specific person's name, and I'm not going to look into it because there's plenty more to go on, and I'm sure at some point I'll specifically speak to some individuals' statements over time. These tropes, these falsehoods, mischaracterize information, and they're misinformation, and it does not help in when this misinformation goads other people into protesting, into doing things that might get them in trouble with the law. Because you know how this goes. You see it in Minneapolis. You saw it before in Minnesota as well as across the country. People use an unfortunate situation and blow it up out of proportion, mischaracterize the law, mischaracterize the actual events, as is becoming even more and more clear as in regards to the shooting of this woman by ICE in Minneapolis. And they use that to promote a political agenda, to promote chaos, whatever their interest is, because some groups just want to promote chaos. Some, like politicians, want to use it for political power and get votes and get, name recognition, all that sort of. This is hypocrisy, and this is clearly just clearly just opportunism used at the hands of politicians. And I'm not saying it's just the left that does this, to be clear, but on this particular case, yes, it is. I've already said in one of my prior podcasts, I think it was yesterday's, that I don't believe this was an act of domestic terrorism. It was clearly from the video that we have now. What she did was wrong. Whether it was intentional or not, I'm not going to say. Let that be for others to investigate and decide. But I still don't really think that would be an act of domestic terrorism per se. Finally, coming back to foreign policy for a moment, one of the things that has come up recently is Trump's commentary on Greenland. And frankly, I think this is one of the cases of Trump pushing something that's it's really annoying to me to see this red herring of an issue that he's actually pushing this implicitly, and it need not be the case. You're causing more harm than good when pushing the idea implicitly. He hasn't actually said that the United States would use military force to take Greenland, but he's saying not taking that possibility off the table, which is why are you saying that? I'm sorry, that's just dumb. Okay. There's a strategic reason why we have an interest in Greenland. And Trump has stated this point about Russia and China taking advantage of the waters around Greenland. And just like Venezuela, having potential to use a territory that is so close to the United States to their advantage, whether that's a military advantage or otherwise, but putting U.S. interests at risk as a result. It's a reasonable, rational interest in Greenland. Now, we do have agreements with Greenland and Denmark, which holds Greenland as a colony, that allow us to have military bases, and we do have a couple in Greenland. Now, why is this not enough for Trump? I don't know. Okay, like I said, this issue is a dumb issue. There are a lot of other things that he can be pushing to promote that interest in protecting our northern flank, as it were, than saying, oh, the United States should just take Greenland. And this idea of paying Greenlanders some sum of money to gain their, their support and in joining the United States in some way. Again, it's a red herring issue, and there's so many other things he could be focusing on other than this, and just let the issue drop. Stop uh, unnecessarily making our allies in NATO fear that he's going to blow up the alliance. I frankly don't think he would ever actually do this because he's not stupid, despite what some of you might think. He clearly is not stupid. So I really think you should drop this and push more. NATO needs to spend more. Okay, we have most of NATO that is now agreed to and is getting to 5% GDP spending on defense. Great. Maybe he needs to put more pressure on Denmark to shore up Greenland as a defense against Russia and China, Russia in particular. Which reminds me, I've got to cover the Russia-Ukraine situation. As it pertains to Russia, actually, I am so sick and tired of I'm so sick and tired of this attempt at peace that clearly is going nowhere. Okay? The pressure needs to be put on Russia militarily. And who needs to do that? Sure, Ukraine needs to do that. Okay? But the West can do more, especially Europe, since it's on your continent, and you should care about that more so than the United States, to effectuate the total collapse of the Russian military in Ukraine. It is possible. I'm not going to go into strategic details, but there are clear things that could be done to scatter the Russian offensive approach and force them onto the defensive. Clear things that can be done. Now, why Ukraine hasn't done that? Maybe they're too focused on this notion of a ceasefire and a deal with Western partners to have a security guarantees and more focused on that than winning the military battle. If you're not going to win the military battle, these ceasefire arrangements aren't even going to pop up in the mind of Putin, let alone ever come to fruition. So I think I don't know what's going to happen with the whole Ukraine-Russia situation. This is going to continue constantly. As you can tell, Putin has no interest in peace because as soon as we, start talking about security guarantees and maybe French and British troops on the ground in Ukraine to promote security, he fires a freaking medium-range intercontinental ballistic missile into Lviv, Western Ukraine, right near the freaking NATO border with Poland. Do you really think that guy wants peace? Or do you think he needs to be, clucked in the nose? We need to we meaning mostly Europe, needs to put vastly more military pressure on Russia so that there's actually military gains pushing Russia back, which, if not gets Putin to the peace table, gets them out of Ukraine. It is possible. Okay, it is possible. There's a lot of voices saying, oh, it's not possible that Ukraine pushes Russia all the way back. They need support, yes. I've said before, not necessarily on this podcast, but Ukraine is going to come out of this, as long as they come out intact, as Europe's foremost military power. Foremost military power. Why? Because they have the experience. They have experience fighting the main adversary that NATO was designed to protect against to begin with. They have experienced officers that have combat experience, as opposed to all the rest of NATO and all the rest of Europe, which has very little combat experience. Compare the numbers of NATO forces, minus the British, that were engaged in, say, Iraq and Afghanistan. Small numbers, small numbers. Now you have Ukraine, with which, by the way, is the largest country in Europe, not counting Russia, uh, who has been engaged in a total war with a massive adversary that should have clearly overwhelmed them within a few weeks. Now, there's reasons why that didn't happen. I'm not going to get into that now, but they have the experience. They are going to be Europe's foremost military power, and we should look at that as an advantage we have in the West against Russia for any future situations that Putin might decide to get involved with. And frankly, I definitely see the potential for a larger scale engagement with Russia, not because of what we do, but because of what Putin wants to do and maybe our own inaction. I would be very concerned about that. And for you, uh, what's the phrase? War doves out there, you libertarians, you isolationist or isolationist aligned individuals in the Republican Party or on the right, whatever have you, a large scale Russian engagement in Europe would completely destabilize the world economy, would probably crush our own economy because, again, with that global connection on the economy that we enjoy as American citizens, we have enjoyed the rewards of that, the fruit of that. It will completely destabilize the world economy. It'll completely destabilize the security paradigm that we have enjoyed for the last 25 plus years, actually 35 plus years, as a serious threat. So ignoring Ukraine and saying, oh, that's just Europe, not a good idea. Not a good idea at all. I know this is going to be at odds with some of the thought process on people on my side. But I encourage you to think about it from the perspectives I have laid out and consider it at least. I'm going to finish up now. And if you have any comments, please go ahead and comment. This is posted on YouTube, on Spotify. I think on Spotify you can only comment once on a video. So if you want to comment and continue a discussion with me or with others that may comment, I would suggest using YouTube. There's not going to be any video playlist with this podcast because I didn't have any. I didn't use any videos to create this. If you want to look up what I cited in law, the U.S. Code, it's available at. Give me 1 second. Oh, I closed it out. Just look up the U.S. Code. It and you can easily look up the laws that I cite. I will not be posting any videos over the weekend. I'll come back to you on Monday. Thank you and have a good weekend.